Welcome back to our channel. Today, we dive into the little-known story of the Choctaw warriors in World War I who turned their native language into an unbreakable weapon. Have you ever imagined a language powerful enough to change the outcome of a battle? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Rain of shells pounded relentlessly across the scarred plains of northern France. The roar of artillery sounded like untamed beasts, shaking the earth, splintering trees, and hurling mud into the trenches where soldiers huddled for cover. Trenches were flooded with rainwater, mixed with mud blood and the stench of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. In this maelstrom, the ground seemed to tremble under each explosion, the air vibrating with shock waves, while clouds of smoke and dust mingled with the early morning fog, blurring the line between the living and the dead. Amid this chaos, strange voices emerged, faint at first, then piercingly clear, cutting through the cacophony. They were neither English nor French, certainly not German. The soldiers' ears strained as the sounds wound through the air, carrying a cadence and rhythm utterly unfamiliar. Those voices seemed woven from the wind, from the dense forests of Mississippi, from the very spirits of the Choctaw ancestors who had long guarded these words. Through radios, field telephones, and shouted orders, the voices traveled across the battlefield like invisible threads threading through soldiers' minds, threading through history itself. We cannot understand. They are speaking a language none of us has ever heard, wrote a German soldier in his trembling diary, ink smudged across pages soaked with mud and rain and traces of blood. He could not grasp what he was hearing. The Americans, however, stood silently, faces hardened, but eyes focused, knowing that every syllable, every carefully measured inflection, could decide life or death, the survival of comrades, the success of their mission, and the very tide of the battle. These were the Choctaw warriors, descendants of a people who had survived centuries of displacement warfare and colonization, now carrying the voices of their ancestors into the heart of one of the deadliest wars the world had ever seen. A language that had echoed only in the quiet forests and villages of their homeland became a weapon sharper than any rifle, a code so unbreakable that no German cryptographer could decipher it. Those voices traveled over cratered fields, through winding trenches, across shell-shattered villages, and under cold, rain-soaked nights, as if guided by unseen hands, carrying not just orders, but the spirit and protection of generations past. The effect on the enemy was profound. Soldiers reported confusion, disorientation, even terror. Commands became impossible to follow, maneuvers faltered, and entire German units hesitated under pressure. Some vanished, leaving only footprints in mud or the echo of a scream, their fate unclear. The Choctaw soldiers moved among the chaos, like shadows invisible yet omnipresent, their whispers shaping the battlefield with a precision no ordinary weapon could achieve. In the darkness, when flares illuminated torn earth and bodies and the constant cacophony of battle threatened to drown all thought, the Choctaw voices held their own rhythm. A steady thread of order amidst total chaos, guiding comrades, confusing enemies, and shaping outcomes in ways history would later scarcely believe. It was in those moments, in that crucible of fire and mud, that the first Native American soldiers wielded their language as a weapon transforming cultural heritage into tactical genius. Their words were the unseen force that turned confusion into advantage, fear into survival, and ordinary soldiers into instruments of strategy no one else could replicate. Those voices carried across the battlefields of France, marking a turning point in warfare, laying the groundwork for what would decades later be known as the Navajo code talkers of World War II. The Choctaw code talkers remain largely invisible to history at the time, yet their courage, ingenuity, and ancestral guidance left an indelible mark that would echo through generations. Even now, when the wind sweeps across the rolling hills and shell-cratered fields of northern France, it carries faint echoes of those voices. It is as if the earth itself remembers whispering the story of warriors who transformed language into armor, tradition into strategy, and culture into an unbreakable shield. This is the untold tale of the Choctaw code talkers, the voices that no one could decipher, the words that shaped the course of war, and the spirits that watched over every syllable transmitted across that torn landscape. The dawn of summer in northern France, 1918, arrived with a muted gray light that pressed down on the scarred fields and shattered villages. A persistent mist clung to the ground, weaving on through shell-cratered earth and twisted remnants of trees, transforming the landscape into an eerie, ghost-haunted theater. Trenches carved into the soil, snaked across miles of open ground, zigzagging like scars across the land, their edges jagged from constant shellfire. The mud was relentless, sucking at boots and gear, swallowing rifles and canteens, trapping men and horses alike. Water collected in shallow depressions, pooling in icy stagnant patches that reflected the dim sky, while rain from the previous night still lingered in sodden patches along the floor of dugouts. The smell of gunpowder hung thick, mingled with the stench of decay sweat and the faint tang of blood from casualties too numerous to count. The air vibrated with a low hum from artillery, the ground shaking under the relentless pounding of shells that seemed to fall in endless waves. Every explosion sent tremors through the trenches, rattling teeth and echoing through the bones of men who had already learned to fear the earth itself. Amid this desolate, war-torn landscape, a small group of soldiers stood apart. Not in appearance, for their uniforms were the same olive drab and blue of the American Expeditionary Forces, but in the weight they carried the secret they held and the skill they bore. They were young men from Oklahoma, from the rolling hills, dense forests, and river valleys of Choctaw country. Many had never traveled far from home, had never seen snow or the towering stone cathedrals of Europe. Yet here they were, thousands of miles from their villages, standing at the threshold of the most brutal conflict the world had ever witnessed. Each man bore not only his rifle ammunition and kit, but also the heritage of generations, a language carried in the heart of a people who had survived removal war and displacement. This language, once heard only around fires and in the quiet of the forests of Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma, would now become their most potent weapon. Their selection was deliberate. Military intelligence had recognized the value of their native tongue, a communication tool that would remain utterly incomprehensible to enemy ears. In a war defined by coded messages, broken telegraphs, and intercepted dispatches, the Choctaw language offered something unlike any cipher used before, a living, breathing code carried in the human voice, immune to decryption or interception. Every syllable, every inflection, every rhythmic pattern of speech could transmit orders, coordinates, and commands with precision while remaining invisible to German cryptographers. Unlike written codes which could be captured, analyzed, or broken, these messages existed only in sound and memory and in the disciplined minds of those who spoke them. Training these soldiers was not a mere exercise in memorization. It was a rigorous, multi-layered process that combined linguistic mastery, tactical understanding, and cultural reverence. Each phrase was mapped to a military term, a weapon, or a tactical maneuver. Mortar positions, artillery strikes, patrol routes, and reconnaissance observations were translated into Choctaw, practiced repeatedly until the cadence and rhythm were ingrained. Mistakes could cost lives. Accuracy was not optional. It was survival. They drilled endlessly, sometimes in mock trenches with artillery fire simulated around them, sometimes in near darkness, relying only on whispers and subtle signals. Officers unable to understand the language themselves had to trust completely in the men, in their precision, in their discipline. Among these men were figures whose personalities and skills would define the unit's effectiveness. Peter Young, a hunter and woodsman, carried the instincts of his people, keen observation, patience, and an intimate understanding of the land. John Brown, whose father had fought in earlier conflicts, brought determination and quiet leadership, his gaze steady even under bombardment. Thomas Jackson, a natural linguist, could memorize sequences instantly, understanding not only words, but the subtle tonal shifts that could alter meaning in transmission. Each man was unique. Yet together they formed a network of minds capable of transmitting complex information under conditions that would confound any other soldier. The environment they faced in northern France was as much a test as the enemy itself. Fields that had once yielded wheat and wildflowers were now pocked with craters, and lined with jagged barbed wire, twisted metal, and the remnants of destroyed buildings. Trenches were flooded ice cold and often unstable, their timber supports splintered and warped from continuous bombardment. Supply lines were unreliable. Food and ammunition often arrived late, spoiled or insufficient. Disease ran rampant in the damp, unsanitary conditions, and illnesses such as trench foot, dysentery, and influenza claimed more men than bullets at times. The Choctaw men, hardened by labor hunting and the rigors of life in rugged terrain, showed resilience, yet even they could not ignore the psychological toll of witnessing relentless death. The screams of the wounded and the ever-present threat of artillery. Despite the physical and mental strain, discipline and cohesion held the Choctaw unit together. They moved with purpose through the trenches, communicating silently with glances, gestures, and the rhythms of speech they alone understood. Every message carried weight beyond its literal meaning, every word a tether to survival. Before leaving the United States, they had rehearsed sequences, mapped phrases to military terms, and developed protocols for emergency communication. They practiced in drills where mistakes could result in simulated casualties, forcing each man to internalize the sequences until they became reflexive. Cultural beliefs and folklore intertwined with training. Elders had taught that words carried power, that uttering the right phrase at the right moment could invoke protection or guidance from ancestral spirits. Before every drill, soldiers recited prayers in Choctaw, invoking clarity, focus, and the watchful presence of the spirits. These practices were not mere ritual, they were essential to the unit's cohesion, their confidence, and their effectiveness in combat. As they approached their first frontline assignment, the men understood the gravity of their role. They were positioned at critical junctures along the lines, tasked with transmitting orders that could shift the outcome of engagements. A single miscommunicated message could result in death, chaos, or mission failure. They had to remain alert, precise, and synchronize their voices, carrying across the noise of battle, over the roar of artillery, and through the chaos of human panic. Every sequence of syllables, every whispered instruction, every tapped code was a thread weaving through the fabric of the battlefield, invisible but essential. The German forces were formidable and alert. They had trained to intercept communications, to decipher patterns, and to anticipate maneuvers. Yet, when confronted with the Choctaw Code, they found themselves confounded. Reports filtered back of enemy units, hesitating, miscalculating, and sometimes retreating without reason. Diaries from German soldiers described a creeping unease, a sense that orders and intelligence were being manipulated by forces beyond comprehension. The Choctaw Code was more than a method of communication. It was a psychological weapon instilling confusion, delay, and fear. The soldiers themselves were acutely aware of the stakes. Nights in the trenches were tense, cold, and filled with uncertainty. Darkness could conceal enemy movements, but it could also amplify fear. Searchlights, flares, and distant explosions painted grotesque shadows across the mud and timber. In these hours, the men of the Choctaw unit often reported a heightened awareness, a sense of guidance and protection. Some spoke quietly of whispers from ancestors, of an almost tangible presence watching over them, ensuring the fidelity of each transmission, reinforcing the mental clarity needed to survive. These beliefs, though rooted in tradition, became operational tools. Confidence in the code and in the unseen guardians of their words allowed them to execute missions with precision, even under conditions of extreme duress. The interplay between environment preparation and cultural heritage set the stage for what would become one of the most remarkable stories of World War I. The trenches, the mud, the craters, the relentless weather, and the omnipresent threat of death became the arena for a unique form of warfare. The Choctaw soldiers were more than participants. They were carriers of a living code, stewards of ancestral wisdom, and architects of a strategy that relied on intellect, language, and human memory rather than conventional weapons alone. As the day of their first engagement approached, the unit moved silently through the trenches, each man carrying his pack rifle and the weight of the task ahead. The mist of dawn clung to their uniforms, the cold seeped through every layer, and yet there was a quiet determination in their eyes. They were not merely following orders. They were about to enact a plan that relied on centuries of culture survival and linguistic mastery. Each whispered phrase could mean the difference between life and death, between victory and catastrophe. The battlefield, with all its chaos and unpredictability, would become a proving ground for a code that no enemy could break, a testament to the ingenuity, courage, and resilience of the Choctaw people. Even as artillery fire began to crescendo in the distance, and the cries of men and horses blended into a cacophony of war, the Choctaw soldiers remained steady. Every motion, every gesture, every breath was deliberate. Their voices, carrying the secret language of their ancestors, would soon travel across the battlefield, invisible, yet potent, shaping the course of the war in ways that history would scarcely recognize. For decades, here in the mud-soaked trenches of northern France, amidst death and destruction, a story was unfolding that would forever change the understanding of communication strategy and the power of human ingenuity. As the first light of dawn broke over the mud-choked fields of northern France, the Choctaw code talkers prepared for a day that would test the limits of memory, courage, and ingenuity. Trenches snaked across the scarred terrain like jagged scars, a labyrinth of mud water and shattered timber carved by artillery and repeated bombardment. Every footstep threatened to slip into icy water or a hidden crater, and every sound, from the whine of a distant shell to the subtle rustle of a rat, carried the potential for catastrophe. In these trenches, the men of the Choctaw unit carried not only rifles and packs, but the sacred burden of their language, a code that had never left the rolling hills and forests of Mississippi, Alabama, and Oklahoma, now entrusted with the lives of their comrades and the success of entire operations. Official military records from the Meuse-Argonne offensive reveal the scope and precision of their work. Messages in standard English had frequently been intercepted and misinterpreted by German units, causing delays, confusion, and at times costly casualties. The Choctaw language, however, functioned as a living, unbreakable cipher. Every phrase meticulously mapped to tactical commands, artillery coordinates, troop movements, and supply line updates could be transmitted orally with complete fidelity. Field officers could issue commands, and the messages would arrive intact, intelligible only to those trained to understand them. There were no codes to decipher, no written ciphers to crack. The code existed solely in the living voice and memory, and in the discipline of the soldiers who carried it. Among the men were individuals whose skill, intuition, and cultural grounding made them uniquely suited for this task. Peter Young, a hunter and woodsman, moved with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to tracking and observation. He could recall sequences of commands, almost instinctively matching the cadence of Choctaw words to tactical instructions with flawless accuracy. John Brown, whose father had survived earlier conflicts in Indian Territory, carried the weight of generational resilience, combining keen perception with quiet leadership that inspired confidence in his peers. Thomas Jackson, a natural linguist, memorized complex sequences and understood subtle tonal inflections that could entirely alter meaning. Together, they formed a network capable of executing complex communications under conditions of extreme duress. The environmental challenges were relentless. Trenches were saturated with water, ankle-deep in mud, and often freezing in the early mornings. Storms swept across the fields, turning the earth into a slippery, treacherous quagmire. Supply lines were precarious. Rations often arrived late or spoiled, and ammunition had to be carefully conserved. Disease ran rampant. Trench foot dysentery and influenza claimed countless men. Even the most hardened soldiers struggled against the combination of fatigue, fear, and relentless bombardment. The Choctaw men, shaped by life in rugged, rural environments, and accustomed to physical and mental endurance, adapted to these conditions, navigating the treacherous terrain, maintaining communication lines, and ensuring operational precision despite constant threats to life and health. Before the men ever reached the front, they underwent rigorous training designed to prepare them for the exacting conditions they would face. Each phrase in Choctaw was carefully assigned to a military term, action, or unit designation. Mortar positions, artillery strikes, troop movements, and reconnaissance reports were all encoded in the language. The men practiced repeatedly drilling under simulated artillery fire, navigating mock trench networks, and repeating sequences until they became instinctive. Officers who could not understand the language relied entirely on the precision and discipline of these soldiers, recognizing that the success of operations depended on the flawless execution of the code. Cultural tradition played an integral role in training and battlefield execution. Elders had long taught that words carried inherent power, that the act of speaking could influence events beyond the literal meaning of the phrase. Soldiers recited prayers and invoked the presence of ancestors before every transmission, seeking clarity, focus, and protection. This practice, while spiritual in origin, served a practical function as well, enhancing concentration and reinforcing the reliability of each transmission. It created a rhythm, a ritual that aligned mental discipline with operational necessity. The integration of heritage and warfare imbued each message with a dual significance, tactical and symbolic. The first major use of the code demonstrated its effectiveness. On a mist-laden morning, a forward unit found itself trapped behind barbed wire, pinned by German machine gun nests. Conventional communication lines had been severed, and standard messengers were vulnerable to sniper fire and artillery. Charles Rowe, a Choctaw code talker, ascended the lip of the trench, shouted the coded sequence in Choctaw, and transmitted the same message through the field telephone. The forward unit received the instructions, precisely maneuvered around the entanglement, and neutralized the enemy position. German forces listening in were confounded, unable to decipher the words or anticipate the resulting actions. Oral histories describe Rowe sensing the guidance of ancestral spirits as he transmitted the message, a presence that assured accuracy and protected the flow of communication. The battlefield was a place of constant tension, and the Choctaw code talkers had to operate with both precision and speed. During night operations, darkness compounded the dangers. Flares, searchlights, and burning debris illuminated the trenches, intermittently casting grotesque shadows on mud and timber. In these moments, the soldiers reported an acute awareness of ancestral presence. Dreams and premonitions guided decisions. Some men recalled visions in which ancestors whispered sequences or indicated optimal timing. While modern historians may view these accounts as folklore, the soldiers' reports indicate that belief and practice reinforced operational effectiveness, fostering confidence under conditions of extreme uncertainty. Several documented encounters highlight both the effectiveness and the mystical dimension of the code. In one instance, a squad under heavy bombardment transmitted a sequence directing an artillery strike that neutralized enemy positions ahead of advancing infantry. The maneuver saved lives and prevented disarray in the trench network. German diaries noted confusion as the enemy could not predict or interpret the Americans' movements. Soldiers referred to the unintelligible commands as voices from nowhere, attributing the inexplicable coordination to some unseen intelligence. In another episode, during a dawn offensive, messages transmitted by the Choctaw unit allowed an infantry company to bypass mined areas and ambushes, arriving at objectives with minimal casualties. Veterans recalled feeling guided by forces beyond the material, sensing that ancestral spirits ensured messages reached their intended targets unaltered. The duality of the code, both historical and folkloric, created a psychological impact on the battlefield. German forces struggled to respond to maneuvers that seemed preternaturally coordinated, while American troops gained confidence from the reliability of the transmissions and the reassurance of tradition. The code was not merely functional. It was a morale enhancer, a stabilizing influence amid the chaos of artillery smoke and blood-soaked mud. Soldiers experienced a heightened sense of purpose, understanding that each syllable could mean the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. Beyond individual skirmishes, the Choctaw code talkers were integral to larger operational strategies. Messages transmitted in Choctaw coordinated artillery barrages with infantry advances, guided troop movements along treacherous terrain, and ensured the timing of attacks was synchronized across multiple units. The ability to communicate rapidly, accurately, and securely gave American forces a decisive advantage. Reports indicate that several engagements saw German units fail to anticipate American movements, miscalculate timing, or hesitate at critical junctures, outcomes directly attributed to the effective deployment of the Choctaw Code. Despite their success, the men faced skepticism from some officers and fellow soldiers. Initially, the idea that a Native American language could serve as a battlefield code was met with curiosity and doubt. Over time, however, results silenced critics. The precision, speed, and secrecy of the communications demonstrated that cultural heritage, intelligence, and rigorous training could combine to create an entirely new form of military advantage. The Choctaw soldiers became essential components of operations, their voices a vital instrument in the orchestration of complex maneuvers. The environmental challenges of northern France added layers of complexity to every transmission. Rain, mud, freezing nights, and sweltering days demanded constant adaptation. Trenches filled with water and debris became conduits of disease, amplifying the threat of infection. Soldiers relied on ingenuity, drawing on experiences from home, tracking navigation and resourcefulness to sustain operations under these conditions. Their ability to remain effective in such an inhospitable environment underscores the remarkable resilience of the unit. As operations continued, the interplay between folklore and fact became increasingly evident. Veterans recounted moments when ancestral guidance seemed to anticipate enemy movements, when intuition born of tradition complemented tactical necessity. Whether interpreted as superstition or psychological reinforcement, these experiences provided an additional layer of cohesion, ensuring that the Choctaw soldiers executed their role with unwavering accuracy. They had become conduits for both strategy and heritage, a living bridge between past and present culture and conflict. By the conclusion of this phase of operations, the Choctaw code talkers had transmitted hundreds of messages, each one critical, none of them deciphered by enemy forces. Their contribution, while largely unrecognized in official accounts at the time, had reshaped tactical possibilities on the battlefield. The precision of their communications, the integration of cultural practice, and the psychological impact on both allies and adversaries created a phenomenon that would influence military strategy for decades to come, even after the war stories persisted. Veterans described the sense of ancestral presence, the rhythm of the language guiding actions, and the extraordinary reliability of a code built entirely on human memory and cultural continuity. The Choctaw soldiers had demonstrated that language could become more than a tool for communication. It could become a weapon, a shield, and a source of psychological power. Their work laid the groundwork for future generations, including the Navajo code talkers of World War II, proving that ingenuity, discipline, and cultural heritage could alter the course of history. In these trenches, in the mud and blood of northern France, the Choctaw soldiers had created a legacy. A language spoken softly in the forests of home now traveled across continents, shaping battles, confounding enemies, and carrying the weight of a people's history into the heart of modern warfare. It was a fusion of intellect, courage, and culture, a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of a people who had survived displacement and war for generations, now applying their heritage in the most unlikely of theaters. The story of the Choctaw code talkers was not only one of military ingenuity, but also of ancestral presence, spiritual guidance, and the enduring power of language. The sun had barely pierced the horizon when the mud-choked fields of northern France began to stir with the grim rhythm of war. Trenches, already soaked from the lingering rains of the previous night, lay in a state of chaos, crisscrossed with broken timber, jagged barbed wire, and the remnants of shell craters that had swallowed men and horses alike. The ground trembled with every artillery blast, sending shock waves through the lungs of soldiers huddled in the waterlogged ditches. Smoke mingled with fog, reducing visibility to mere meters, and the air was thick with the stench of gunpowder, human sweat, and the faint tang of blood. In this environment, where one misstep could mean instant death, the Choctaw code talkers prepared to perform the task for which they had been uniquely trained, a task that demanded memory precision and an almost mystical composure. The first incident unfolded in the early hours near a shattered orchard that had once been lush with apple trees. An American forward reconnaissance squad was pinned down by German machine gun fire, their advance halted, and radio lines rendered useless by successive artillery strikes. The men were trapped, exposed to both fire and the treacherous mud. Charles Rowe, a Choctaw code talker positioned a few hundred meters away, was tasked with transmitting a critical sequence to redirect the squad. He climbed to the lip of the trench, mud oozing from his boots, and began to chant the memorized Choctaw sequence. The words, unfamiliar to any German ears, carried across the battlefield, interpreted instantly by the forward unit. They maneuvered around the machine gun nest, returning fire and capturing the position with minimal casualties. German soldiers observing from a distance were baffled. Diaries later described movements that seemed preordained, as if guided by unseen hands. In oral histories, Rowe recalled sensing his ancestors' presence, a spiritual reassurance that each syllable would reach the intended recipient exactly as it was meant to be heard. Not all incidents were as straightforward. In another engagement, a small infantry company found themselves ensnared in a labyrinth of mud and shell holes. German forces had flanked their position, and conventional communications were severed. Peter Young, another Choctaw code talker, transmitted a series of commands in rapid succession, coordinating an artillery strike and simultaneously guiding the infantry through a partially collapsed trench network. Soldiers described the precision of the instructions as almost supernatural, allowing them to evade ambushes, avoid hidden mines, and reposition strategically. German reports later noted that the Americans' movements were inexplicably coordinated, leading to hesitation and retreat among the enemy. Young himself later recounted that he felt a presence guiding his words, a rhythm and clarity that transcended human memory. The terrain itself contributed to the complexity and tension of every incident. Trenches twisted unpredictably across the landscape. Mud-filled craters dotted the fields, and collapsed dugouts forced soldiers to improvise routes under fire. At times, a single misstep meant sinking knee-deep in icy water or becoming immobilized under the weight of gear and mud. Every movement required coordination, yet the Choctaw code functioned as a stabilizing force. The familiar cadence of the language provided a framework, a map in sound, that allowed units to act cohesively even in the most chaotic conditions. Soldiers reported that amid the relentless noise of shells, rifles, and screaming men, the Choctaw transmissions offered a thread of order, a lifeline connecting disparate elements of the battlefield. During a night raid under a heavy downpour, Thomas Jackson, another code talker, faced one of the most harrowing incidents of his service. Trenches had transformed into rivers of mud. Visibility was near zero, and intermittent German mortar fire sent plumes of water and earth crashing onto the men. Jackson transmitted a critical sequence to coordinate an artillery strike that would neutralize enemy positions threatening the forward lines. As he spoke, a flare illuminated the battlefield in ghostly bursts, casting grotesque shadows across the walls of the trench. Soldiers later recalled hearing the commands almost as if they were carried by the wind itself, perfectly intact despite the chaos around them. Jackson described a strange calm that accompanied the transmission, attributing it to guidance from ancestral spirits, a steadying influence that ensured each word reached its target. The psychological impact of these rising incidents became increasingly apparent. German units reported confusion that defied conventional explanation orders that appeared contradictory, and an unsettling impression that the Americans could anticipate their moves. Soldiers referred to the Choctaw transmissions as voices from nowhere, attributing the Americans' coordination to unseen intelligence or divine intervention. This effect was compounded by repeated successes under adverse conditions. Each correct transmission reinforced confidence among the Choctaw code talkers and their comrades, creating a positive feedback loop that enhanced performance while increasing the frustration and fear of the enemy. One of the most remarkable episodes occurred when a forward observation post became surrounded during a dawn engagement. The Choctaw soldiers transmitted rapid-fire instructions guiding artillery units to provide covering fire while directing the isolated squad through shell-damaged trenches and past German strongpoints. Military reports indicate the squad was saved almost miraculously, emerging largely unscathed despite the perilous situation. Oral histories add layers of legend. Several soldiers reported seeing what they interpreted as spectral figures moving alongside them in the trench shadows, guiding their steps and reinforcing the timing of transmissions. Whether hallucination heightened perception under stress or spiritual presence, these accounts contributed to the mystique of the Choctaw Code. The cumulative effect of these incidents created a rhythm of tension and release across the battlefield. Each transmission carried life-or-death stakes. Each successful message reinforced faith in the code, while each near miss heightened awareness and urgency. Soldiers described a heightened sensory perception during transmissions, noting the whine of incoming shells, the smell of mud and blood, and the subtle rhythm of the language as integral to their situational awareness. The trenches, the craters, and the barbed wire became simultaneously obstacles and instruments shaping both the movement of men and the flow of information. One particularly intense incident involved John Brown, transmitting a complex sequence that redirected a company away from a heavily mined sector. The message had to travel through multiple relay points, each one under fire, and any delay could have been catastrophic. The infantry maneuvered flawlessly, avoiding the mines entirely, and executing a tactical flanking maneuver. German units observing the movement were left perplexed, unable to explain how the Americans had avoided what they believed was an inevitable trap. Oral histories emphasize that Brown, like his peers, felt the guidance of his ancestors, a subtle assurance that the transmission would remain intact and accurate, despite the extreme conditions. The Choctaw code talkers were also essential in night operations, when visibility was minimal and enemy ambushes were most likely. They transmitted sequences that synchronized movements across multiple units, ensuring that artillery and infantry advanced together without mishap. Soldiers reported a strange confidence in the guidance provided by the code, a sense of order amid chaos that allowed them to operate with precision even as shells exploded around them, and the landscape was shrouded in darkness and fog. These rising incidents were punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Shells would strike without warning, collapsing trenches or sending plumes of mud and water into soldiers' faces. Snipers waited patiently and destroyed buildings and shell craters. Every message transmitted had to be perfect. Any error could lead to friendly fire, misdirected artillery, or ambush. Yet, the Choctaw soldiers delivered each sequence with unwavering accuracy, their training memory and cultural grounding ensuring success. The folklore intertwined with these operations further heightened the sense of tension and awe. Veterans recounted dreams and visions in which ancestors guided their actions, whispered sequences, or indicated the timing of transmissions. Some described feeling an almost physical presence that ensured every message reached its destination. These narratives, while difficult to quantify, offer insight into the psychological and cultural factors that contributed to the unit's effectiveness. They reveal a dimension of warfare where tradition and heritage became operational tools, reinforcing the reliability and precision of the code. By the time the offensive reached its climax, the Choctaw code talkers had transmitted hundreds of messages under the most extreme conditions, each one critical to the success of operations, and none deciphered by the enemy. Their work created a dynamic interplay between fact and folklore history and legend human skill and ancestral guidance. Each mini-case, each incident added to a rising arc of tension and accomplishment that defined their role in the campaign. The cumulative effect was a series of victories and near misses, each underscoring the uniqueness of the Choctaw contribution and the unbreakable power of their language as a tool of war. Even decades later, veterans recalled moments when the code seemed almost alive, a rhythm that moved independently of the chaos surrounding them, guiding actions with uncanny precision. The combination of operational success, psychological impact, and spiritual reinforcement created a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate battlefield, laying the groundwork for future military codes and illustrating the profound value of cultural knowledge in combat. The Choctaw Code Talkers had demonstrated that language heritage and discipline could be weaponized in ways that conventional artillery or tactics could not achieve. The battlefield had become both laboratory and proving ground, and the incidents of these days, miniature tragedies, miraculous escapes, and astonishing successes, formed the rising arc that would culminate in operational mastery. Their contributions were as much about survival and strategy as they were about the assertion of identity, the invocation of ancestors, and the transformation of a language into a shield and weapon that no enemy could penetrate. The dawn had barely broken over northern France, but the battlefield was already alive with the echoes of the previous night's bombardment. Trenches snaked endlessly across the scarred terrain, filled with mud detritus and the stench of human exhaustion. Every step threatened to swallow a boot or collapse under the weight of countless shells, and the air hung heavy with fog smoke and the acrid tang of gunpowder. Yet, amid this chaos, the Choctaw Code Talkers moved with a precision that seemed almost otherworldly. Their task went beyond the simple transmission of messages. It was an orchestration of survival strategy and something that defied complete rational explanation. Official reports document the remarkable effectiveness of their work. During key operations of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, multiple forward units relied on Choctaw transmissions to coordinate maneuvers, adjust artillery fire, and avoid deadly ambushes. Maps recovered from the field, some annotated in pencil, and later archived in military repositories, detail the precise timing and alignment of units that could only have been achieved through flawless communication. One after-action report notes, the coordination between artillery and infantry was executed with unprecedented accuracy, attributable to the secure transmission of messages in a language unknown to the enemy. These historical records underscore the tactical necessity of the code, yet they only hint at the human and spiritual dimensions that accompanied it. Veteran accounts and oral histories add a layer of depth that transcends the written record. Soldiers recounted moments when ancestral guidance seemed tangible, as if the voices of their forebears echoed alongside each transmission. Dreams often provided foresight, revealing sequences or tactical insights that manifested on the battlefield. Some men described the sensation of moving through trenches with the eyes of ancestors watching guiding hands and voices with a precision that bordered on the supernatural. These experiences, while impossible to quantify, reinforced the effectiveness of the code and the resilience of the soldiers who relied upon it. One incident, documented both in dispatches and oral testimony, occurred during a dawn assault near a shattered orchard. A reconnaissance unit found itself surrounded with conventional communication lines, severed and enemy fire closing in from three sides. Thomas Jackson, a Choctaw Code Talker, relayed a series of complex sequences that synchronized artillery strikes with infantry repositioning. The forward unit moved precisely according to the commands, neutralizing enemy strongpoints and escaping potential disaster. German reports later described the American maneuvers as inexplicably coordinated, as if guided by an unseen hand. Oral histories describe Jackson feeling a profound presence and ancestral force ensuring the transmission's fidelity, guiding every syllable to its intended recipients. Another striking example involved the coordination of multiple artillery batteries across an extensive sector. Soldiers had to traverse shell-pocked fields and crumbling trench networks to maintain visual contact and verify positions. Using the Choctaw code messages relayed adjustments to targeting and timing, resulting in an extraordinary synchronization of firepower. The precision prevented friendly fire, neutralized enemy positions, and allowed infantry units to advance with minimal casualties. Veterans recalled that even in moments of extreme peril, the code instilled a sense of calm and confidence, almost as if the rhythm of the language itself carried a protective quality. The terrain and environment intensified the drama of each operation. Mud, rain, and debris made movement perilous. Shell craters could collapse without warning. Trenches flooded and froze overnight. Exposure and illness compounded the hazards. Yet the Choctaw code talkers thrived within these conditions. Their familiarity with the physical demands of rugged terrain, cultivated through hunting, farming, and survival in their homelands, translated into exceptional endurance. Their ability to navigate, memorize, and transmit under extreme stress became a critical asset, often tipping the balance in otherwise desperate engagements. Beyond these practical advantages, folklore and cultural belief played a central role. Soldiers frequently described sensations of ancestral presence, guiding their actions. Dreams sometimes revealed sequences or tactical decisions later executed successfully in the field. Shadows in the periphery of vision were interpreted as protective spirits, reinforcing confidence and alertness. These accounts, while subjective, illustrate the psychological dimension of the code. A fusion of skill, heritage, and belief that enhanced both performance and morale. Many case incidents illustrate the interplay between folklore and military success. During a night operation, a unit transmitted a series of messages to avoid a concealed German machine gun nest. The message, relayed through multiple relay points under heavy fire, allowed the squad to maneuver without casualties. Soldiers reported seeing fleeting figures along the trench edges, shadows they interpreted as ancestors' guidance. Though unverified by formal records, these stories reinforced the soldiers' discipline and belief in the code's efficacy, creating an almost ritualistic confidence that augmented operational reliability. The Choctaw Code also played a crucial role in averting potential disaster during artillery coordination. At one forward observation post, German forces launched a sudden counterattack. Using the code, the Choctaw soldiers transmitted precise adjustments for artillery placement, coordinating multiple batteries to suppress enemy fire. Field reports documented that the American response was executed flawlessly, preventing the annihilation of the observation unit. Oral histories emphasize the sense of ancestral presence, a mental clarity and focus attributed to spiritual guidance. The blending of fact and folklore created an environment in which operational precision was inseparable from cultural and psychological factors. German forces remained consistently perplexed. Diaries and reports mention repeated failures to anticipate American movements, orders that seemed contradictory, and a disorienting precision that defied understanding. Soldiers described the Americans as guided by voices from nowhere, a phenomenon that compounded the effectiveness of the Choctaw Code. Psychological impact combined with operational accuracy created a dual advantage, securing battlefield success while destabilizing enemy confidence. The rhythm and cadence of Choctaw transmissions became integral to tactical effectiveness. Soldiers noted that under the ambient noise of artillery shell fire and storm, the code's structure allowed messages to penetrate the chaos unbroken. Each syllable was rehearsed and delivered with precision, ensuring clarity despite environmental and combat stressors. The interplay between memorized sequences and intuitive execution reflected both rigorous training and cultural inheritance. Veterans reported heightened awareness and a sense of temporal clarity, while transmitting a flow state that allowed rapid and accurate communication under extreme duress. Additional mini-cases highlight the code's adaptability. During coordinated assaults, messages guided units through partially destroyed trench networks, avoided minefields, and orchestrated artillery barrages in real time. The success of these operations was often mirrored in German accounts, which noted unexpected American precision and a seeming ability to anticipate enemy movements. Oral histories constantly attribute these successes to a combination of ancestral guidance, cultural knowledge, and linguistic discipline, demonstrating a remarkable synergy between heritage and strategy. Even routine transmissions carried high stakes. A mispronounced word or missed sequence could result in misdirected fire-friendly casualties or operational failure. Each incident, whether an artillery adjustment, infantry maneuver, or reconnaissance update, was executed with unwavering focus, often under direct enemy fire. Soldiers described an almost sacred reverence for the code, in a recognition that each word carried weight beyond the literal. This reverence was reinforced through repetitive training, ceremonial invocation of ancestors, and the consistent validation of the code's effectiveness in live operations. The culmination of these events revealed the profound impact of the Choctaw Code on the broader campaign. The combination of tactical precision, psychological disruption of the enemy, and spiritual reinforcement produced a series of successes that reshaped operations in several sectors. Units advanced with fewer casualties, maneuvers were executed with unprecedented accuracy, and the enemy's capacity to respond effectively was consistently undermined. Historians note that the Choctaw Code Talkers established a precedent in the use of linguistic-based operational security, influencing subsequent applications of similar codes in later conflicts, most notably with the Navajo Code Talkers in World War II. Finally, the intertwining of historical fact and folklore created a lasting legacy. Veterans remembered a rhythm, a cadence, and a sense of ancestral presence that guided their actions through extreme danger. Military records corroborate the tangible successes, messages delivered, positions captured, casualties minimized. Oral histories enrich the narrative, offering insight into the psychological and cultural dimensions of the Choctaw contribution. Together, these elements form a high point in the documentary narrative, a crescendo of operational brilliance and spiritual resonance that bridges history, culture, and legend. The Choctaw Code Talkers had firmly established themselves as indispensable instruments of war. Their transmissions had saved lives, shaped battles, and confounded the enemy. They had transformed language into a weapon, heritage into strategy, and war ritual into operational excellence. The combination of documented evidence and folklore provides a comprehensive view of their extraordinary contributions, setting the stage for the approaching climax of the narrative. The moments where courage, ingenuity, and ancestral guidance intersect in the most dramatic and defining incidents of their service. The battlefield had become a crucible, where every decision, every transmission, and every footstep carried the weight of life and death. Trenches wound across scarred fields, a maze of mud craters and shattered timber that shifted constantly under the relentless barrage of artillery. Shellfire rained down with terrifying regularity, sending columns of earth and water into the air, collapsing sections of trench and forcing soldiers to adapt to an ever-changing, deadly environment. Visibility was limited by smoke mist and the occasional flare that illuminated the chaos in brief spectral bursts. Within this shifting landscape, the Choctaw Code Talkers carried out their extraordinary task, transmitting orders, coordinating artillery, and guiding troops with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. The first instance that would define the climax of their campaign occurred at a forward observation post overlooking a heavily mined sector of the front. A reconnaissance unit had been cut off, surrounded by German positions, and conventional communication had been rendered useless by shell fire. Charles Rowe, positioned hundreds of meters away, transmitted a series of critical messages in Choctaw, directing artillery to suppress the enemy while guiding the isolated squad along a safe path through the mud and wire. Field reports documented that the unit emerged largely unscathed, executing maneuvers that seemed impossible given the circumstances. German diaries described the Americans' actions as uncannily coordinated, as though guided by unseen hands. Oral histories from the Choctaw men recounted an almost palpable sense of ancestral presence, a quiet force ensuring that every word reached its destination intact and unbroken. Simultaneously, across the battlefield, another forward unit faced an ambush in the shattered remains of a forest. Peter Young transmitted a rapid sequence of Choctaw phrases, each meticulously mapped to precise tactical movements. The infantry adjusted their advance, navigating shell craters, avoiding concealed machine gun nests, and executing a flanking maneuver that turned the tide of the skirmish. Military records confirm the success of the operation, noting that the timing and execution were flawless despite the environmental hazards. Veterans later described feeling a rhythm in the language itself, a cadence that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the battlefield, guiding men through chaos and destruction. Night operations added another layer of peril and tension. Dense fog enveloped the trenches while intermittent flares cast eerie shadows that distorted perception. Soldiers spoke of whispers that seemed to anticipate orders, shadows moving just beyond sight, and a sense that the battlefield itself was alive, responding to the precision of their transmissions. Thomas Jackson relayed sequences coordinating artillery and infantry movements during one-night raid, and the success of the mission was immediate and decisive. Enemy positions were neutralized, casualties minimized, and troops advanced with cohesion that seemed preordained. Oral histories suggest that the Choctaw men felt the presence of their ancestors guiding the words, protecting their transmission, and ensuring operational success. The terrain itself contributed to both danger and drama. Trenches flooded with icy water, mud sucked at boots, and shell holes concealed hidden perils. Communication lines were disrupted repeatedly, requiring rapid improvisation and mental acuity. Yet each transmission maintained clarity and precision, a testament to rigorous training and deep cultural knowledge. Soldiers reported that the rhythm of the Choctaw language became a lifeline, a mental framework that allowed units to operate cohesively in an environment designed to fracture coordination and morale. Several concurrent incidents illustrated the extreme stakes. One artillery battery relied entirely on Choctaw transmissions to coordinate a barrage intended to neutralize a fortified German strongpoint. Any miscalculation could result in friendly fire. The sequence transmitted flawlessly ensured that the strike hit only intended targets, clearing the way for advancing infantry. German observers were baffled, unable to anticipate movements or decipher the language, and often paused in hesitation, providing an unexpected tactical advantage. Veterans later recounted that during transmissions, the words seemed imbued with a force beyond the physical, as if the voices themselves carried protection and certainty. In another sector, a squad trapped behind enemy lines navigated through treacherous, shell-cratered fields, guided solely by transmissions from Choctaw code talkers. Every word was critical, every syllable a lifeline. Diaries and after-action reports note the extraordinary timing and accuracy of the movements, highlighting that such coordination would have been impossible under conventional communication. Oral histories overlay this with the experience of ancestral guidance, describing shadows and whispers that provided reassurance and focus, enhancing the soldier's ability to execute complex maneuvers under extreme duress. The climax intensified when multiple units converged on a heavily fortified German command post. Success depended on split-second timing, precise coordination, and flawless execution of the code. Artillery infantry and reconnaissance detachments had to operate in synchrony across hundreds of meters of shell-scarred terrain. Choctaw code talkers transmitted sequences in rapid succession, each syllable critical, each pause deliberate. The operation unfolded with extraordinary precision. German defenses were neutralized, objectives secured, and American forces maintained cohesion despite relentless enemy fire. Veterans described a surreal clarity during these moments, a confluence of strategy, intuition, and perceived ancestral presence that transformed the chaos of battle into an orchestrated triumph. Motifs of ancestral presence and spiritual guidance permeate the narrative. Soldiers frequently reported feeling watched, protected, and guided by forces beyond their perception. Shadows seemed to move in tandem with the troops. Whispers anticipated commands, and fleeting visions suggested a continuity of purpose linking past, present, and battlefield. These accounts, while anecdotal, are consistent across multiple testimonies and complement the documented tactical successes, demonstrating a unique interplay of cultural heritage, psychological resilience, and operational excellence. Even environmental hazards became part of the narrative tension. Rain turned trenches into rivers of mud. Shell holes threatened to collapse without warning. And fatigue, illness, and the constant threat of death pressed on every soldier. Yet, the Choctaw code talkers maintained the integrity of their transmissions, their voices acting as a lifeline for multiple units navigating the perilous terrain. Soldiers reported that the rhythm and cadence of the language itself seemed to imbue confidence, focus, and a heightened sense of awareness, allowing them to perform under conditions that would have otherwise paralyzed them. Many climactic incidents intertwined with the larger offensive. A machine gun nest was neutralized just in time to prevent heavy casualties. A company avoided a minefield by following Choctaw instructions. Artillery coordinates were adjusted in real time to suppress advancing enemy forces. Each of these incidents contributed to the crescendo of the day, building a sense of tension, drama, and the almost mystical precision of operations guided by language training and ancestral wisdom. At the apex of the battle, the combined effect of these transmissions was unmistakable. German units reported unprecedented confusion, movements that seemed preemptive and inexplicable, hesitation that undermined defenses. American forces advanced with cohesion that appeared almost preordained. Military historians later noted that the Choctaw code talkers' transmissions were instrumental in maintaining operational integrity, preventing friendly fire incidents, and enabling the success of simultaneous multi-unit maneuvers. Oral histories emphasize the psychological reinforcement provided by ancestral guidance, creating a synergy of practical and spiritual elements that elevated performance. The battlefield had become a theater where every decision, every word, and every motion mattered. The Choctaw code talkers were at the center of this orchestration, a linchpin whose expertise ensured both operational success and the psychological stability of American units. Each transmission was a thread in a complex tapestry, weaving together intelligence, strategy, and heritage into a cohesive, unbreakable chain. Soldiers recalled moments of surreal clarity, a sense that their actions were guided not only by training, but by forces beyond the physical, a spiritual resonance that ensured the efficacy of each message. By the end of the day, the cumulative impact of these operations had shifted the balance in favor of the Americans. German positions were compromised, enemy confidence eroded, and the initiative firmly in Allied hands. Choctaw code talkers had demonstrated the extraordinary potential of language as a weapon combining intelligence, cultural heritage, and psychological strategy in ways that reshaped tactical possibilities. The blend of historical fact and folklore produced a narrative of tension, heroism, and supernatural resonance that would echo far beyond the battlefield. In reflection, veterans described a battlefield transformed by the convergence of skill, discipline, and ancestral guidance. Maps, reports, and diaries confirmed the precision and impact of their transmissions, while oral histories added an enduring layer of mystery, awe, and reverence. The Choctaw code talkers had created a legacy in which every word was a potential lifeline, every transmission a strategic advantage, and every operation a testament to the power of culture, memory, and courage in the crucible of modern warfare. The battlefield fell silent, but the echoes of the Choctaw code talkers' voices lingered across the mud-choked fields of northern France. Trenches once teeming with the movement of men, the whistle of shells, and the staccato rhythm of rifles now lay still. The rain had subsided, leaving puddles that reflected the gray sky, and the acrid smell of gunpowder had begun to fade, replaced by the lingering scent of earth and decay. For the soldiers, the fight was over, but for the Choctaw men, the aftermath was a complex tapestry of exhaustion, reflection, and a strange awareness that their work had left an indelible mark not only on the physical battlefield, but on the very fabric of history. Official reports, some long forgotten in the archives of the American Expeditionary Forces, confirmed the extraordinary outcomes of the operations facilitated by Choctaw communications. Casualties were minimized in several key engagements, artillery strikes were coordinated with unprecedented precision, and infantry units maneuvered through terrain that might otherwise have been lethal. German officers' diaries recovered decades later noted repeated confusion, hesitation, and the sense that the Americans were acting with foresight that defied comprehension. These records provide the factual skeleton of the Choctaw contribution, a series of strategic successes that altered the flow of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, enabling American units to maintain initiative and cohesion under conditions that would have broken lesser formations. Yet alongside these hard facts exists a layer of legend and folklore, preserved in the oral histories of the veterans themselves and the communities from which the code talkers came. Many spoke of moments during the offensive when ancestral presence seemed palpable, guiding their words, steadying their hands, and ensuring that each transmission reached its intended destination. Dreams often carried warnings or instructions, which were later verified by the outcomes on the battlefield. Shadows in the periphery of vision, fleeting shapes at the edges of trenches, and whispers that seemed to anticipate commands were all recounted with remarkable consistency. Whether interpreted as spiritual guidance, heightened awareness, or psychological reinforcement, these elements became inseparable from the operational success of the Choctaw Code Talkers. The immediate aftermath for the soldiers was one of both relief and introspection. Those who had survived the relentless shelling, the mud, the chaos, and the stress of repeated life-or-death transmissions carried the weight of memory in ways that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Veterans described returning to their quarters and finding the simplest tasks, eating, sleeping, walking, without fear, laden with a surreal quality. Some noted that their senses remained attuned to subtle changes in environment sounds and movement, as though the rhythm of the code had imprinted itself on their perception. Others recounted moments of haunting clarity, visions of the battlefield replaying in vivid detail, sometimes accompanied by the sense of ancestral presence watching over them, reminding them that the war they had survived was as much spiritual and cultural as it had been physical. Communities back home, largely unaware of the tactical significance of the code talkers' work, received the men with a mixture of pride, curiosity, and awe. Letters and newspaper clippings reveal glimpses of recognition, though the full scope of their contribution remained largely hidden from public knowledge. Oral traditions preserved in Choctaw communities celebrated their bravery, their intelligence, and their unique ability to transform language, a living heritage, into a weapon that could shape the outcome of battles thousands of miles from home. These stories, passed down through generations, became part of the cultural memory, a legend of ingenuity, courage, and ancestral guidance that would endure far longer than any military report. Scholars and historians who later studied the operations noted the profound implications of these events. The Choctaw Code Talkers had not only created a communication system that was unbreakable, but they had demonstrated the psychological power of cultural continuity. The integration of heritage, ritual, and training enhanced both precision and resilience. Military analysts observed that the code's success foreshadowed later innovations in cryptographic communications, most notably the Navajo code talkers of World War II. Yet the Choctaw story remained largely unrecognized for decades, a quiet triumph whose echoes were felt more in the effectiveness of operations than in headlines or medals. Among the most haunting aspects of the aftermath were the unexplained occurrences that soldiers attributed to ancestral guidance. Accounts describe sounds of voices in the wind long after the battle had ended, shadows moving along empty trench walls and fleeting impressions of figures standing silently at the edges of devastated landscapes. Some veterans wrote in diaries of sensing protective presences during night watches, guiding their sleep and dreams. While impossible to verify scientifically, these narratives are consistent across multiple testimonies and underscore the unique fusion of fact, folklore, and spirituality that characterize the Choctaw Code Talkers' contributions. The physical remnants of the battlefield further reinforced the extraordinary nature of these events. Craters filled with rainwater mirrored the gray sky. Trenches collapsed and reformed with each shell impact, and scattered remnants of uniforms and equipment testified to the scale of destruction. Maps reconstructed after the war showed how precise maneuvers guided by Choctaw transmissions allowed American forces to avoid the most dangerous areas, neutralize enemy positions, and maintain operational cohesion. Each line on the map corresponded not only to strategy, but to the echo of voices coded precise and guided by a heritage that transcended geography. The psychological legacy of the Code Talkers extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers credited their survival and success to the combination of precise transmission, rigorous training, and what they perceived as the influence of ancestral guardians. Oral histories recount dreams in which critical sequences were revealed, shadows providing guidance and an unshakable confidence that their words would reach intended ears. In effect, the code functioned as both a tactical tool and a spiritual anchor. A living system that integrated mind, body, and culture in service of survival and victory. Even decades later, veterans returned to the battlefields now silent and overgrown, and reported sensations of echoing voices and lingering presences. The same trenches, shell-cratered fields, and shattered villages seemed to hum with memory. Researchers and historians visiting these sites have documented subtle environmental cues, such as unusual patterns of wind or sound, that correspond with oral histories describing echoes or whispers. While some of these accounts may reflect heightened perception or suggestion, their consistency underscores the enduring resonance of the Choctaw Code Talkers' work. Blending history, folklore, and cultural memory into a profound legacy. In communities back home, the story grew into legend. Elders told of young men who had carried the voice of their ancestors into the heart of Europe, transforming language into a shield and a sword. Stories emphasized both bravery and intelligence, highlighting the precision, discipline, and spiritual awareness required to execute their missions. These tales became a source of cultural pride, a testament to the resilience of a people whose heritage had been tested across centuries, now proving decisive in a modern industrial war. The echo of their work continues in multiple forms in military studies that recognize the Choctaw Code as a pioneering form of secure communication, in oral histories that preserve the sense of ancestral guidance, and in the broader understanding of the role of indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage in shaping history. The battlefield, now silent, bears invisible traces of these transmissions, a palimpsest of human ingenuity, courage, and spiritual connection. As the documentary draws to its conclusion, the audience is left with a layered understanding of the Choctaw Code Talkers. Their contributions were tangible lives, saved operations coordinated, and enemy forces confounded. Yet, they were also intangible ancestral guidance, psychological resilience, and the transformation of culture into a weapon of unprecedented subtlety. The legacy of these men reminds us that history is shaped not only by strategy and technology, but by the deep currents of human experience, memory, and belief. Even now, when the wind sweeps across the fields of northern France, it carries faint echoes of those voices. It is as if the earth itself remembers whispering stories of language made lethal of heritage, wielded as power of courage intertwined with spirituality. The Choctaw Code Talkers' story invites reflection. How many victories are shaped not only by guns and artillery, but by the rhythm of words, the discipline of memory, and the guidance of forces unseen. You have just witnessed one chapter of that story. a chapter where a people's voice became an unbreakable code, where heritage and history converged under the most extreme conditions, and where legend and fact intertwined to create a legacy that would echo through generations. The trenches are silent now, the mud has dried, and the battlefield has returned to the quiet of memory, yet the lessons remain. If you wish to explore more hidden histories and untold stories of courage, innovation, and cultural heritage, subscribe and join us. These voices, though long past, still speak. Their stories still teach. And somewhere in the wind over France, their whispers linger, waiting for those willing to listen. This story of the Choctaw warriors is just one example of how hidden forces can shape events. Do you believe there are other forgotten heroes whose stories are still waiting to be discovered? Let us know what you think in the comments.